Well, thank you all so much for joining us for the introduction of Justice for All Civil Rights Act. As you all know, I am from Detroit, the most beautiful blackest city in the country, and it's also where we birth movements. This bill is part of a movement in our country to help restore the true core intent of the Civil Rights Act, to continue again to call of justice to protect every person in our country from discrimination. As you all know, as an attorney myself and others that work in the field and work in protecting folks from discrimination, we know that the courts have been stacked with conservative judges that have led to decisions that water down the Civil Rights Act. This is all happening despite Congress prohibiting discrimination based on the basis of race. Courts have allowed racial profiling, redlining after court case after court case. Despite Congress prohibiting discrimination in employment, courts have created defenses for employees to escape liability and they retaliate against many of our residents who in the workplace. And again, all of it's protected under court case after court case. Despite Congress prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex, courts have condoned discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And despite Congress having prohibited discrimination against Americans with disabilities, courts have refused to protect people living with disabilities and have left them with little to no recourse. Despite Congress authorizing private rights of action of people to legally enforce their own rights, courts have approved forced arbitration contracts, leaving the American people with little recourse for violation of their civil rights. I have worked hand in hand with civil rights leaders and attorneys across the country, those that work on disability rights, on civil rights, and a number of things, especially even those that have been working in Detroit against the emergency manager laws that were in place for years. We have spent our careers fighting against these kinds of decisions that have been made in the courts, again, because when we weren't looking, the courts were stacked. And now, again, we have seen the Civil Rights Act that many of us have fought so hard to have in place get watered down. So the Justice for All Act restores the availability of discrimination claims based on disparate impact. This is so important because discrimination is discrimination regardless of intent. Disparate impact allows us to look at the implementation of policies that, again, negatively impact our residents. It also includes private right of action, prohibiting forced arbitration, and clear monetary damages and attorney's fees for plaintiffs and their advocates so that we can enforce our rights and stop discriminatory behavior without having to rely on prosecutor offices to do the right thing. Justice for All also protects people in all aspects of life, like housing, schooling, public accommodations, commercial enterprises, employment, federally funded programs. And I know I'm sick and tired, as everyone else is, of seeing our neighbors with nowhere to turn. Extreme right-wing elected officials are also right now pushing new attacks on our people and our rights every single day. We have an unhinged Supreme Court, as you all know, eager to approve and continue these kinds of abuses. And I know many of my colleagues and I won't stop until we get justice for all. I am incredibly grateful of those that have co-sponsored Justice for All Civil Rights Act. This includes the National Lawyers Guild, which I'm a proud member of, Defending Rights and Dissent, the National Council on Jewish Women, and also recently endorsed by the Congressional Progressive Caucus. So I can't thank you all enough again for all these groups and others that have worked so tirelessly with me on this. With that, I'm going to introduce the amazing chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Stephen Horsford, who has come here as well as representing, of course, the amazing community that he does. But I first got to know Stephen as a father with his daughter who's looked up to him so proud. He has truly been a great friend in Congress and somebody that I'm so pleased has joined us in supporting Justice for All Civil Rights Act. With that, Chairman.
Thank you to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. Thank you for this invitation. I'm pleased to be here. Stephen Horsford, representing Nevada's 4th Congressional District and currently serving as chair for the Congressional Black Caucus. As we all know, federal courts have eroded some landmark laws that were designed to make this country for the people. And in recent years, conservative stacking in our courts and Mitch McConnell's refusal as majority leader previously to allow President Obama all of his rightful judicial appointments are continuing to chip away at many of those protections. The Justice for All Act is designed to restore many of the rights that have been taken away. One key provision ensures the private right of action and a prohibition on forced arbitration, ensuring that all victims of discrimination have their day in court. The bill will also allow everyone the right to fight the bias that they may encounter every day, whether it's discrimination in trying to rent or buy a house, or inflated insurance rates based on a protected category like race or religion. Too many Americans, as an employee or as a consumer, face discrimination in many aspects in their day-to-day life. And right now, as many LGBTQ+ Americans are under attack in many states, the Justice for All Act clarifies that sexual orientation and gender identity are protected classes by key civil rights law, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and the Age Discrimination Act of 1975, as well as the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. These are the cornerstones that members of the Congressional Black Caucus have worked for and on behalf of during our 51 years of existence. We are against discrimination in all of its forms, and we support this legislation, Justice for All Act, because it helps to protect all individuals from forms of discrimination. I want to commend Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib for her leadership and for introducing this important legislation, and I look forward to working with her to advance it. And with that, I will yield back.
We will now have Cody Bloomfield, Director of Communications. Oh, I'm sorry, Rhea. Rhea Thompson-Washington, who's on the National Executive Board of the National Lawyers Guild. Oh, I'm so sorry. Excuse me.
Good morning, y'all. My name is Rhea Thompson-Washington. I use she, they, and elle pronouns. This is important because this bill, this legislation that is being introduced today, is intended to protect me. I'm the daughter of a sharecropper from South Carolina and an immigrant from the Dominican Republic. All of the things that are listed in this legislation, all of the pieces of this legislation that are important are intended to make sure that I get to live the American dream as it was promised to my parents. It's important that we, the National Lawyers Guild, which has been the National Lawyers Guild, which has been defending dissent since 1937 and protecting the right of people to protest in the streets, emphatically supports this legislation because it is the reason that we are in the streets. It is the reason that we protect people, that we make sure that folks understand that policing right now is not the way that it is working the way that it's intended, but it's not working on behalf of the people. Right now in Atlanta, there are people who have been charged with domestic terrorism for protesting the ways that the forest is being deforested, is being taken over, and being used to create a city solely for the purposes of tamping down dissent. That's not something that we can stand for. This legislation is important because it will give people the opportunity to have this equal say in the courts when it comes to defending themselves against harmful police officers. This legislation is important because it will give people the opportunity, as folks mentioned already, to not be forced into arbitration or into ways to solve problems that are unfair to them. The National Lawyers Guild is emphatically in support of this legislation, and we're so thankful to be out here with you all today. And thank you so much, Representative Tlaib, for inviting us to be here. Thank you.
Cody Bloomfield, Director of Communications for Defending Rights and Dissent.
Hello. Defending Rights and Dissent is a 62-year-old civil liberties organization dedicated to making the Bill of Rights a reality for everyone in the United States. And throughout our tenure, we've been proud to stand with members of Congress who have offered up bold legislative proposals to protect the basic rights of the people. The Justice for All Civil Rights Act is very much such a proposal. It is our honor to endorse it, and we applaud the leadership of Representative Tlaib on this and on so many other important issues. The Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, and numerous federal statutes all protect core rights. But we know that without effective remedies for when those rights are violated by the government, those rights become meaningless. Congress has recognized this too, and that is why, for over 150 years, they have enacted laws that allow individuals who've had their rights deprived under the color of law to hold the government accountable in civil court. Unfortunately, the courts have thwarted the clear will of Congress time and time again by making it harder and harder for those who have had their fundamental rights violated to seek redress for the harm done. They've created numerous hurdles to justice, the most notorious of which is the court-created doctrine of sovereign immunity. The Justice for All Act makes sure that the Bill of Rights is not merely words on paper. It restores Congress's intent in giving people a meaningful remedy for the deprivation of civil and constitutional rights. It will make sure that there truly is justice for all. And that is why Defending Rights and Dissent is proud to stand here today, alongside Representative Tlaib and the other leaders on this bill, and we urge Congress to pass this vital legislation. Thank you.
Good morning or afternoon. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of the way. There we go. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you to my sister in service, to Congresswoman Tlaib, for organizing this press conference, and thank you to my sister for your leadership on the Justice for All Act, and to my colleagues, to Rep. Horsford, and to those that are not able to be here, Congresswoman Lee. Thank you for your leadership as well and support. You know, this past Tuesday marked 58 years since the events of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, where white law enforcement officers mercilessly beat unarmed civil rights advocates marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, including a 25-year-old activist named John Lewis. Those activists and many others put their lives on the line to end Jim Crow and achieve rights for all in this country. And because of them, Congress passed strong civil rights laws, including the Civil Rights Act, including Fair Housing Act, Age Discrimination Act, and others. These visionary laws were intended to protect people from discrimination and have served as a moral compass of the law for decades. But for all the progress that we have made since Bloody Sunday, at every step of the way, we have encountered people who want to strip away our civil rights and do it at all costs. It's because these perverted and selfish folks with this selfish vision of society, their idea means that some people have rights and others don't. The decades-long assault on civil rights from conservative politicians, it has been clear, from George Wallace to Strom Thurmond to Mitch McConnell. But what is less obvious is the decades-long assault on civil rights from conservative judges. One of the most devious and destructive developments in our jurisprudence is the idea that our federal civil rights statutes apply when discrimination is intentional, and not when there is a discriminatory effect, but no intent. In effect, what this means is a judge, often a judge that's hostile to civil rights, has to look inside people's minds and guess their intent, regardless of whatever obvious evidence of discriminatory impact that exists. This makes no sense, and it is a right-wing tactic to gut our civil rights protections. That's why the Justice for All Act is so important. It would amend key civil rights statutes to make clear that discrimination is illegal, regardless of intent. It would also create private rights of action so people can seek accountability for violations of their civil rights. It would end legal impunity for government employees by eliminating qualified immunity and ensuring that local governments can be liable for the acts of their officials. And it would clarify the definition of sex for purposes of civil rights laws to include sexual orientation, pregnancy, gender identity, and any sex-related traits. This package of necessary and common sense reforms would revitalize our civil rights laws, which have endured decades of attacks. It would overturn conservative court rulings and restore the original intent of landmark civil rights laws. It would carry on the legacy of civil rights, the legacy of the civil rights movement, and ensure a better quality of life for all people in this country. That's why I am so proud to support and to stand alongside Congresswoman Tlaib and others supporting this legislation. Let us pass the Justice for All Act and continue in our struggle to uphold civil and human rights for everyone. Thank you.
I'm Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and I serve on the House Judiciary Committee. I am honored and privileged to be here with Congresswoman Tlaib for this initiative that is long overdue, and the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Stephen Horsford, my colleague on Judiciary, Congresswoman Bush, and all of the advocates who are so rightly here today. I always like to give an anecdote to let you know how important justice for all is. First of all, the Civil Rights Act did not come on a bright and sunny and shiny day. It came through the loss of life of those foot soldiers, many of whom we met in Selma just a couple of days ago, who realized that the issue of civil rights, whether it was in accommodations at that time, was really a birthright of Americans. If you took the Constitution and utilized only the 14th Amendment of equal protection under the law, the Civil Rights Act had to be strong to ensure the protection for those in housing, age discrimination, educational protections that do not then be subjected to discrimination and a discriminatory impact. So that Justice for All restores the strength of the provisions to ensure that disparate discriminatory impact allows you to have what I like, a private right of action. So let me give you what I'm fighting right here, right now in the 21st century. We're fighting the takeover by the state of Texas of a perfectly performing, improving majority-minority school district that has overcome the pandemic. The children will bring tears to your eyes of how hard they have worked. We didn't have the CHIPS bill, and so they didn't have access in many instances to broadband or a laptop, of which the school did try to, school district, give everybody one in their home, but everyone could not access. But they struggled on. And all of the statewide tests, they made good marks, if you will. And one of the schools that Barbara Jordan and Mickey Leland went to had a downside, but it rose up to the cause and made good marks. Phyllis Wheatley High School. We'll be marching there on Saturday. We'll be marching because we will not allow our children to be denied and denigrated. But this bill, Justice for All, as I've written to the President and to the Secretary of Education, help us because these children are being discriminated against. You're using a state law and you're not giving them a reprieve to make the argument that they have improved academically. You are discriminating. That means one child will be able to have a private right of action for discrimination and their civil rights being violated. Right now, we're dependent on the Title VI complaints that have a certain protocol, but one child. And so I wanted to rush here to be able to go from one crisis, the crisis of the toxic waste coming to Houston from the East Palestine disaster. I wanted to come here because our children are our future and our priority. And so I am delighted to be part of the introduction and co-sponsorship of the Justice for All. The Judiciary Committee Democrats are waiting with welcome arms to be able to push this legislation and extend the protections to make the civil rights legislation stronger and to honor the foot soldiers and to ensure that those who are disabled, those who are women, those who are people of color are not failed in this system of government and that the Constitution is lifted up through this legislation whose underpinnings stand on the Fifth Amendment, the 14th Amendment of due process, and actually, of course, the right statutorily to have a fair and unbiased right to education. And I would argue that this legislation should be passed expeditiously to be able to protect our citizens from discrimination in all aspects of life, and to make sure that, I might add, the definition of sex to explicitly include sexual orientation, pregnancy, gender identity, sex stereotypes, and any sex-related traits. And yes, to protect our transgender children as well. And so thank you for the leadership. Thank you to the National Lawyers Guild. And thank you to my colleague from Michigan. We are always in the same boat sometimes, and we're on the same team. Thank you so very much.
I'll open up for any questions. Any questions? Rita wants a picture. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, Michael. Yeah. Yeah, one of the things I do talk about specifically, I mean, Michigan, for instance, lost more Black home ownership than any other state in the country. And, trying to connect not only obviously the rhetoric here, the fear mongering, hate rhetoric that's coming out of some folks in regards to just even any action in trying to say we need equal justice for all, for anyone. And is that understanding some of the, federal, the fair housing, age discrimination, you name it, hasn't actually been available to so many people because of how much it's been watered down. So I talk about housing. I talk about auto insurance. People don't realize, even in auto insurance, there's these proxies to discriminate. They use marital status, gender, age. They also use credit score. All this has nothing to, these are non-driving factors that is used to layer and keep people in the cycle of poverty. And University of Michigan has done study after study regarding it. And so it's important to understand that, Justice for All Civil Rights Act is basically restoring the true intent of Congress at the time in regards to trying to, again, protect people from age discrimination, protect people from, being denied access to housing and all these other opportunities. The fact that many of the things that we see now, even when I hear my colleague from Texas talk about the takeover or the schools, that's happened to Detroit. And Detroit's, 80% plus district that had, the state taking over for over a decade, our school system, in a way that, again, disenfranchised so many majority Black students. Much of what we're trying to do is to address these kinds of disparities and inequality that we continue to see. When I was at National Lawyers Guild, we had worked on so many different cases. It wasn't just police brutality and so forth. It was just even people having freedom of speech, speaking up. And we had to show this higher threshold of intent. This is an intentional restoring it back to disparate impact, having disparate impact, which was the true intent of many of the civil rights advocates, because they know we're not going to find as lawyers an email that says, hey, specifically give a higher percentage rate to Latinos, because one bank, actually an email was found saying if somebody comes in with a heavy accent, go ahead and charge them a higher interest rate. I mean, this stuff is actually happening, and corporations after corporations and folks have used the courts to, again, take away the rights that Congress has codified over and over again. So we want to go back to that true intent of what Congress intended when we try to prevent these types of discrimination and make sure that we truly are a country that is equal justice for all. I mean, it's hard with this because I think much of the pushback will be that people right now, I mean, I used to think voting rights was bipartisan. It always was. And it now is becoming very racialized to the point where people feel like something like this wouldn't be about them. Well, I can go to congressional district to congressional district and show them from age discrimination to people that have been forced into, these arbitration in the workplace, even though we know that they were specifically discriminated based maybe on income, gender, name it, you name it. I don't know if it's going to be possible this term, but this is a way, and many of us advocates have been talking about this, university campuses have been talking about this, and that continue to reference Civil Rights Act. We want to remind people the Civil Rights Act is not what it was when it got passed the first time around. 65, 68, you can see that these court decisions, these literally case laws, have been used to push back against that intent. And so we're using it to organize and educate. And so I'm hoping colleagues will listen, because they're going to run into a situation. If it's auto insurance discrimination, housing, age, we see that a lot now. They're going to run into a resident that all of a sudden says, I don't have access to the courts. I can't do anything because of forced arbitration, or because there's case law that says I don't have standing or the threshold to be able to get to the court. So I'm hoping, again, Justice for All Civil Rights Act is a moment for folks, especially in this chamber, that continues to reference the passage, understand that it isn't as it was passed. It has changed overwhelmingly to the point where, again, a lot of Americans have been disenfranchised and not having access to the judicial process. So I'm going to, talk about these things and reference so much. I mean, the disability protection right in here, disability rights in this bill alone, working with an amazing advocate from Michigan who actually is based out in DC. He's, even after cases of showing us just how unbelievably discriminatory all levels of government and private sector has been towards those Americans living with disability, that should be a wake-up call that this bill is important. Any other questions? Yeah, I mean, I think I've talked to some members of the administration about some of the broken systems. And then I always say, I wonder if we had disparate impact, we could be able to push it. Now, where this comes into play is that, this also allows us to bring an action against government action. So I think there would, obviously be some pushback in allowing them to be exposed to that. But I think if we're really a country that is going to follow, again, I know you put the true Bill of Rights and all these things, that if we're really for that, then we should allow every American a day in court to defend themselves. And so I'm hoping they would get on board, and I'm always welcome if they hear me for a conversation about this.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course.